who's been texting me nonstop for the last 3 days about the confidence episode because she's obsessed with it.
I think that was one of our best episodes.
She's
I think
like, it's so fucking good. She loves every episode, but this one in particular, she was like, I have things to say, I have thoughts around it. But she also said, she was like, oh, also the reminder to give this show 5 stars. Keep doing that, because she was like, I realized I haven't given you 5 stars. And also she was like, even though I'm saying, holy shit, I need to do that. She's like, I still haven't done it. Like right now I'm telling you, I haven't fucking done it. I know I want to. And she was like, keep putting that in the show. Keep reminding us. Cause she was like, honestly, the more you remind me, like the more likely I will actually do it. And I know, Justin, you had said that, but I just wanted to echo it, that someone else was like, dude, she literally was like, yeah, I got to give you 5 stars. I haven't done it yet, though. And she's like, so
great.
Keep doing it.
So if you're listening right now, we just got our cold open. If you're listening right now and that's you, give us 5 stars and rate us. Thank you.
Pause this episode.
Yeah,
go do it now.
Yeah,
either
do it
like
right
it
just
now.
pause. Go do it. You're not going to remember to do it later. You're not going to. Do it right now. Welcome to No Clear Answers, where we explore the common challenges all humans, creators, and leaders face and break down preconceived notions of common self-help ideas. We are your hosts. I'm Ricky Goldenberg.
I'm Justin Mulvaney.
And I'm Dr. Corey Wilkes.
Oh my goodness.
Look at us.
There we are.
The 3 sexiest toasts there ever were. If you agree, consider pausing and going and liking, subscribing, and rating 5 stars on whatever your app of choice is. And if there's a headline there, there's the 3 sexiest toasts there that ever was and will be.
Mm-hmm.
And if you disagree, catch me outside.
Corey, immediately after asking for a rating, threatens our viewers.
Perfect.
That's beautiful.
I think that's effective.
Today's topic, we're going to explore the topic of boundaries, but we're going to explore it through a very specific lens, which is a question that we're going to pose and see if we can come to a good answer to, which is, how do I set boundaries to empower the life, relationships, and results that I want? And there's two reasons why I phrase the question this way. One is boundaries frequently feel like they cut something off, right? They're saying no. And there's a lot of fear around setting boundaries in my experience with people of what's going to happen, what am I going to lose? And I want us to explore, how can we set boundaries such that it empowers what we want? And secondarily, boundaries frequently come up relationally, right? And I think that's a good place to explore them, but it's much more than that. It's relationships with people. It's relationships with work. It can empower the life that you want. It can empower the results that you want at work. Boundaries are a very, very powerful tool. And so to kick us off, I always like to start here. Let's search for if we can define what we mean when we say this, which is, what do you mean by boundaries? What's the definition of boundaries for you?
I mean, a boundary is basically a line I am willing to enforce that you do not cross.
Yes. And that line that I'm setting is in service of you and me. I think that's really important as well. When I think about boundary work, like you were saying, Justin, you're saying it's like this, I'm putting up a wall, and Corey, I love that. It's a line. We don't cross it. And it's in service of both of us. It might not feel that way to someone in the relationship, but ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to create the ability to continue in some fashion.
Yeah, I really like how we're constructing that. I'm going to say something that jives so that it doesn't build on it, but I think of boundaries almost, when they're at their most clean, they're almost like an algorithm, which is that they're a device by which to create clarity, which is, if you do this, then I'm going to do that. And so it's really providing clarity for the people around you of, hey, if XYZ happens, if ABC happens, here's how I'm going to act. That way that person knows when they're interfacing with you, hey, this is a boundary. If I step over that, this is what I can expect from that person. So a boundary at its best really sets a lot of clarity and expectations. And like you said, Ricky, is meant to be aligned to be in service of everybody in the space. So if that's what a boundary is, let's start with, why does this matter? Like, why do we care? Why is it important to effectively set good boundaries? And another way that we can think of this is what happens when people are really good at setting boundaries?
I think, so for me, the reason I set boundaries is because I don't want to be a doormat. Okay. A lot of people are doormats, meaning they let people walk all over them. For me, in any situation, a boundary is basically me communicating the rules that you need to abide by if you are interacting with me. Now, it isn't necessarily overt or rigid, like you have to, refer to me as Dr. Corey or Dr. Welch or some shit. Like, I'm not in medicine anymore. It doesn't matter. And even then, it didn't fucking matter. Plenty of people call me Corey. It isn't that. It's more so if you want me to be present in this interaction, these are the stipulations. You're not going to talk to me a certain way. You're not. So like with coaching, for example, this doesn't really come up in coaching because, coaching clients are awesome, but I'm not available 24/7. Like you can't send me a text message at 3 a.m. and expect me to immediately respond. Right. That's a boundary I'm setting with you of like, hey, you're fine to hit me up via email in between sessions. However, understand I am not at your beck and call. Okay. I will respond when within a reasonable amount of time that is convenient for me at that point. Okay. And yes, I think one of the issues that people struggle with boundaries is they inherently are selfish because they are self-centered. These are my boundaries. You do not cross these if you want me to continue being there in that conversation, in the room, in the whatever, right? But for me, a boundary is basically me saying like, here's what I need out of this interaction to fully show up. And I will respect your boundaries too. So I need to know what your boundaries are. Okay, whatever those are. And then we agree to mutually respect each other's boundaries so that we both can show up fully with psychological safety, with the vulnerability or the presence required for us to both move forward with this relationship. Okay. Now, obviously there are much more concrete examples of boundaries of like, you're not going to degrade me. You're not going to punch me in the face. You're not going to spit on me. Like basic shit like that. Like if you're from like a rougher upbringing that you probably have those experiences with of like, hey, motherfucker, like you're not going to talk to me like that. But most of us as adults generally don't have those interactions on a day-to-day basis. So it's usually boundaries are communicated not for safety reasons, but for higher level reasons around respect. Does that make sense? Because it's like, look, here's a boundary. If you spit in my face, I'm going to fucking punch you in the throat. Like that's a boundary, sure, but like that doesn't come up in normal conversation with civilized people.
Yeah, it is a good example, though. It does extrapolate to the other thing. The hyperbole of it says, here's what a boundary looks like. If you do this, I'm not here for it. Here's what I'm going to do. Now, there's a certain violence back to that boundary, which is not what we're striving for with boundaries, but I think it's a good example.
I also think there's something unique there that, since I love to bring in the pop culture, recently, I think it was last year, that there was a component around a famous actor and the messages that they had sent their partner, that they framed it as boundary setting, but it was actual control. And so I think what Corey stated here that's really important to note is that part of boundary work is around setting your boundaries, kind of what is important in terms of your own psychological safety, your self-care, what is required for you. I cannot necessarily control you. I can tell you what I want that will help support me. But in this example, the individual is saying like, if you wear this, then you're doing that to me and I don't have space for you. That's not boundary setting. That's control. And so I think it's also really important that we think about boundary setting. It's in our purview, and other people are allowed to disagree and not like the boundary and butt up against it. And that's where the play is.
Yeah. Like you said before, Ricky, like a good boundary empowers both parties. It's saying, if you do this, then I'm going to do that. You're empowered around, here's going to be my response to that. And the other party is empowered to make a decision around how to operate with your boundaries. But it is not saying you shouldn't be doing this. That's not a boundary.
Yeah. This is hands to ourselves.
Well, it is. It kind of is a boundary, but it's going to have an effect. It's probably not the one that we're talking about here today.
But important to note, because I think some people think that boundary setting is like we get to just externalize that on everybody else that's around us, and it turns into control, which is not what we're talking about. We're talking about how am I handling kind of what's in this bubble and how you are coming into my space, and we can work together in a positive way.
Yeah.
I would add that on.
Yeah. I think here's the beautiful thing that I think there are about boundaries, which is when you do boundaries well, they actually increase your capacity to be with what's most important to you. And I mean this in a couple ways. One way that this is saying, let's use an example of like work-life balance. Having a boundary with work is a way of saying, hey, I'm going to contain work because what's most important to me is something like health and wellness or family. And so the boundary actually lets you go be with what's most important to you elsewhere. But it doesn't actually just apply to elsewhere. It can actually be with the thing, right? And so, when a boundary is set really well, let's say I really care about work, but I set a boundary with work, which is, hey, when work gets like this, I'm going to step away. What that actually helps me do, oh, wow, fireworks. If you're watching on YouTube, that's how good my point was. The technology loved it. I got to find my way back here. Is setting a boundary with work actually enhances your capacity to be with the objective reality of work. It's saying, this is too much for me. My system's starting to get overloaded. And so if I effectively set a boundary, it actually lets me step back and be with the thing more effectively. It's the same thing interrelationally, right? Relational boundaries. It's, hey, I really love you. Our relationship is really important to me, but I'm having a really hard time being with how you're being right now. And so what relationships lets you do is say, or rather boundaries let you do is say, I'm going to consciously disconnect now because I'm not actually available for you. I'm going to step away. And when that's done well, it actually gives you space to like be with the person or love the person just as they are. Whereas my experience is when I'm boundaryless and I sit there and I play with it anyway, I kind of get into this downward spiral where I'm trying to change you and things just get really, really messy. So boundaries done well enhance your capacity to be with what's important to you.
I think.
Well, like I'm not setting a boundary around you. I'm setting a boundary around myself.
That's
yes.
it.
That's the difference.
And that's really important that we're highlighting here. And in that space, a boundary, I'm saying no so that I can say yes.
That's it.
That's what I'm doing. I'm saying no so that I can say yes, right?
It actually
and I think your
enhances
examples,
that.
Justin, were really tight, which is like, I'm saying no to work so that I can say yes to some home balance that I need. Or I'm saying no to being grinding at all hours because I'm saying yes to recognizing that if I step away from work, I will be more effective at handling the discomfort of something that's happening within the workplace. It actually, when you were saying that, it reminds me a lot. I think one of the things that broke my brain, total aside, is around budgeting. Right? We were talking about how some of the boundary work here is like, oh, if you set boundaries, we're like slicing and dicing, we're getting like more and more controlled. One of the best things that I had ever heard about budgeting was that most people see budgeting as saying no to things. No. But if you do budgeting well, it's actually saying, yeah, spend money on that. You got money to burn on that. Because now we're thinking about, well, where do you want to spend your money? This is the same. Where do I want to spend my energy and time that is helpful to me versus what is loudest to me? That's usually what's happening within boundary work, is that we are often people pleasers by nature. We often are people who want to say yes. We don't want to disappoint others or ourselves. And so it's more around recognizing, well, what do I need? How can I communicate that and move through it in a way that's supportive so that I can say yes to things that are important to me?
Yeah, to just say it one more way, my experience is that when we set boundaries, it's because we notice that we have a hard time being with what's in front of us just as it is, and we're starting to disconnect. And there's a way where a boundary is conscious disconnection. It's saying, hey, I'm going to choose, because I can't be with this, to disconnect, such that it enhances my ability to come back and connect with it. Whereas the alternative, especially in interpersonal relationships, is I don't set the boundary. I'm pretending to be with you, but I'm disconnected. And then my experience is in relationships, you can stay in that state for weeks with both of you pretending like you're connected, but really being disconnected, all because you couldn't consciously disconnect.
Well, also because we're not communicating what we require in the boundary. Instead, we're doing other activities. We're avoiding, we're ghosting, we're having quiet resentment. We're avoiding the discomfort of actually having to recognize and communicate and then uphold a boundary. Instead, we're trying to get around it, and we're skirting it, and we're making a lot of stupid assumptions.
Yeah, and we're disconnecting anyway. So we're kind of in the next question. So let me just drive us here, which is how are people bad at boundaries? We've highlighted how they're important, but what are the ways where people do boundaries poorly, and what happens when they do?
I have one example that I would love to share. And by the way, I should own up fully that one of my favorite books on this topic, if you're reading this and you're like, ooh, I want to get a little bit more. I know that normally we leave tips and tricks for the end, but I'm just going to do it now because I have to, which is Nedra Glover Tawwab. She has Set Boundaries, Find Peace. It's a book. She also does Instagram. That's how I initially found her, but I read the book. So a lot of my stuff is taken from this because that book broke my brain. I read it right before the holidays. Should not have read it right before the holidays because a lot of it is around boundary work with family. And I was like, oh God, I'm not doing anything right. It is fantastic. But one of the things that I pulled out of that in terms of, I mean, let's be honest, we're all really bad at boundaries. Boundaries are really difficult. They're really complicated because they have to do with relationships with ourselves, with others. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. It's really difficult to recognize when you need to set boundaries. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that a major pitfall that we run into is not setting the boundary, like not recognizing that it needs to be set, setting it, communicating it, and then upholding it is a major second component of boundary work. Sometimes we communicate a boundary and then we just don't follow it, right? Corey, your example, you can email me and I'll get back to you in like a specific amount of time. But if I'm not doing that, if I am emailing back every time 30 seconds after they email me, I'm not upholding the boundary that I sent. Or if I tell you, you can't email me, but when you do, I do respond, I'm not upholding the boundary, and it's not their fault, it's my fault. So that's one of the things that I think we get wrong. We get wrong at setting the boundary and communicating it effectively and clearly. And we're really shitty at upholding it once we have set it and being able to make sure that we're maintaining that boundary. And then the second area that I'd say that we suck at is we suck at thinking about boundaries in general. She plays them into porous, rigid, and healthy, which I think is important too, which is that sometimes porous boundaries are like, we don't really set them. It's kind of loose. We say, don't email me, but when you email me, I do respond. Or we say, don't ask me last minute to visit, but then you do, and then I still come and visit. It's sort of like I'm not holding them. Rigid, I feel like I'm talking about Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Rigid is it's a boundary bully, which is something Brene Brown says. I'm basically like, you can't have anything. There's no flexibility. No one can act in this. This is my world. Healthy is somewhere in the middle. Goldilocks, and the Three Boundary Bears. It's the story I'm telling now. Those are some things we get wrong.
Corey, I love Goldilocks and the Three Boundary Bears, by the way. That's one. Take it away. Somebody write that fable or throw it into ChatGPT and have ChatGPT write it for us.
A couple things I see people get wrong with boundaries, beyond what Ricky said around porous versus rigid and upholding them. Justin, earlier you said, there was a tone of violence in one of my examples with setting boundaries, right? Of like, look, if you call me this name or if you spit on me, I'm going to punch you in the fucking throat. A lot of people, boundaries are inextricably tied with communication and values. And a lot of the things that people also struggle with those. So a lot of times people think that communicating a boundary means confrontation. And confrontation means the threat of aggression or violence to some degree, whether it is aggression as far as like relational aggression or actual physical aggression. So people may try to intimidate you, try to coerce you. They may ostracize you from a social environment because you said you needed to leave at 4:00 today, and you've told your boss for the last 3 weeks and whatever, but then your coworkers are like, oh, well, you're a slacker. Oh, you aren't invested in your job, so we're just going to kind of give you the cold shoulder because you're not one of us anymore, right? Because we all have toxic fucking work ethics, and we work all day every day, and fuck any other thing we want in life. We live for our job. I've seen people do that, of like, I got to go pick up my kids, and I've told you all this. I actually showed up an hour early today so that I can leave 30 minutes early, right? I'm still actually here longer than you all, but because I left at a time when you all were still here, you all have now socially ostracized me and talk shit about me, right? People are afraid something like that is going to happen. So because they're afraid of some sort of retribution or something like that, they don't set boundaries that they know they need to set. I am afraid of how you will respond, even though I initially know that this is a good boundary for me to set, because I get so wrapped up in your response to me setting that boundary. I then begin to question whether or not that boundary is worth setting. And then I just kind of give up on it. Okay?
Corey, I want to hop in here because the pattern that I see in that is that tells me that a person doesn't really trust themselves to set boundaries. Because what I hear is, hey, I'm afraid if I set this boundary, there's going to be this response, which breaches another boundary of mine. I don't want to be with people who socially ostracize me for doing these things. And very frequently what it is, hey, I don't want to set a boundary because I'm afraid that their response will breach another boundary of mine, and then I'll be powerless.
Yes. And I think that a lot of us also don't like being uncomfortable. We don't like upsetting people, right? We don't want to be the one who leaves at 3:30 to pick up our kid and make it seem like we're not doing enough work. And so rather than setting the boundary, we avoid it. We get quietly resentful. We make assumptions that they should just know that we showed up an hour earlier. So of course we can leave 30 minutes early. And so that gets really difficult when in fact, if we take time and recognize setting the boundary, there could be those negative responses. And if we recognize that that can happen and we get comfortable with it because we know it's in service of a boundary that we need to set in order to be best version of self, yeah, some people are going to avoid you. Some people are going to be little toxic motherfuckers talking shit behind your back, and they're going to be gossiping. Some people are going to get angry. Some people are just going to straight up ignore it, right? You say, you need to call me before you come visit. I need a phone call before you come visit. They don't like the boundary. They just keep showing up. And then it's about upholding it.
For me, boundaries are about self-respect. So when I see somebody who struggles to set boundaries, I see somebody who struggles with self-respect. Like they just, I don't say a lot of prescriptive shit, but that is probably one of them. Like if you suck at setting boundaries, you probably suck at respecting yourself. Okay. Just point blank, probably one of the things you struggle with. Because if we think about like a physical boundary in the world, why do we set boundaries, right? Like, why do you build a fence? Why do you lock your door? You do these things because you have decided that the things within that boundary are valuable and worth protecting, right? I lock my door because my family is worth protecting, for example, or my TV or some shit is worth protecting from random people, okay? I build a fence, I do this, I do that to protect, right? If I have a garden, I build a fence so the fucking deer and shit can't get in it, okay? Because I value what is within that boundary. So if you struggle to set boundaries, that typically means what you're saying is you do not value yourself, your own needs, your own wants, your own desires, your own goals. So now you have said what everyone else wants is more important than what you need. Okay. And that is a deep underlying symptom that is probably causing a shit ton of problems beyond that in your life.
This is probably the biggest thing, Corey, I think that you're pointing to now, which is people can get into a place of really self-righteous victimhood around boundaries, which is blaming others and going, they should know better. They shouldn't be treating this way. They're operating from expectation and then really being passive aggressive about it. This is one of my ways. By the way, I literally had porous written down. So I love the fact that we all triangulated on that. The first is I'm porous. I just don't set them. I don't even have them. I just let them float there. The second way, Corey, is what you're saying, which is I'm operating from expectation and passive aggressive. I'm telling the world how they should be without actually setting a boundary. And really, I feel empowered because I'm like righteous and angry and blaming, but I'm actually not, because I'm letting what I don't want to have happen continue. I'm in the stance of victimhood. And from that place, I'm not creating what I really want.
I don't know if you all ever heard of Sarah Knight. She's got a really good TED Talk and a couple books. But I think the TED Talk is something about like the life-changing magic of not giving a fuck. And the whole premise is she talks about like your fuck budget and how many fucks you have on a day-to-day basis. A fuck is basically your time, energy, and attention. Like, what do you give a fuck about? Meaning, what are you willing to invest your limited time, energy, and attention into doing? She's like, so, and this is an older TED Talk. She was like, when I say I don't give a fuck about Game of Thrones, what I mean is I do not prioritize spending my time, energy, and attention trying to stay up on Game of Thrones, right? Like these finite fucks I have on a day-to-day basis, I need to allocate to what actually matters to me, right? So when you clarify this, it helps you set boundaries of like, I'm not going to fuck with keeping up with daily drama. I'm not going to do this I'm not going to go to this fucking employee appreciation bowling party to be around a bunch of motherfuckers I don't like. I'm never going to talk to you if I don't work here. I don't fucking like bowling. I can't drink the beer. I can't have the fucking pizza. I don't want the pizza, whatever. It's like, but you're going, or because it's somebody's birthday and you're like, oh, I feel obligated. Fuck an obligation. Because most of the shit we think is obligatory isn't. We have this script that it is, which causes us to not set those boundaries because like, oh, I have to do it. Who the fuck said? There are very few things you actually have to do that you have real obligations to. And yes, those are worth, trying to negotiate if you need to set boundaries around. Sure, of course. But the majority of the shit you think you have to do, you just fucking don't. But until you really assess what are my values, what do I need to fully show up for the things that actually truly fucking matter, until you really sit and figure that out, you don't even know how to negotiate boundaries because you don't know what is worth building a boundary around. I'm also oppositional. So setting boundaries has like never really been a huge issue for me because like I don't like personality wise, I don't give a shit about confrontation. I don't give a shit about you thinking I'm an asshole. I don't give a fuck. I'm going to die one day, memento mori. I could give a fuck what your opinion of me is. I'm fucking with my family, my loved ones, my friends, my business. I don't give a fuck about you and your opinion. But that's a me thing, and that causes separate issues, right? But I think if you do struggle with boundaries and you do struggle with confrontation and you do struggle with this script of, if I set a boundary, what will other people think? How will other people respond? This fear of ridicule I talk about with the 4 horsemen of fear, right? Like that is a fear of ridicule. How will other people respond if I do this thing? That's really, really hard to negotiate, which is also why you should work with me for coaching. But it's hard to negotiate. So many people fucking struggle with it. But it's about boundaries. It's about valuing yourself, respecting yourself, and what you actually need to fully show up to what matters.
Yes. Here, Twab says this too, but people benefit from you not having boundaries. You don't. So when I don't set boundaries, when I don't communicate them and uphold them and take that time to think about how many fucks do I have to give in a day and what are the things that I'm obligated to do versus would like to do, and am comfortable with pissing some people off, no one is going to do it for you, right? Like if you think about an employer, Your employer is never going to want to give you more work-life balance. Your hourly rate just went up. They want more of your time. They're never going to be the one that says, do less. Same with family, right? They're probably always going to want more. They're always going to want more. And it's going to be up to you to think about, what does this look like? And what do I need? And we inherently are terrible at it, partially because we're bad at thinking about what do we need. We're bad at assessing what are the fucks that I give, right? We're bad at transitioning from obligation versus joyous interaction. We would rather often not have to take that time and realize that we're going to die one day and that we have to spend our time the way that we want to. And instead, we're just going to get caught up in the emails that we have to send at 2:00 in the morning because that makes us feel like we're participating in society. Call bullshit on that. Let's focus in and hone in on what is important to you and how you want to spend your time and get a little bit more comfortable with pissing some people off around it.
A few things here. Ricky, yes, you are right that when you are in positions of genuine zero-sum games or people who want to extract things from you, the other people, they do benefit. They benefit from your not setting boundaries. I want to break that narrative for the people who really care about you, for the people who are really important and want to be with you, they actually also don't benefit from you not setting boundaries. There's a state of disconnection. There's a state of the relationship suffers. Like the people who really care about you, as much as there's a fear and they may have a negative reaction the first time you set boundaries. Boundaries can be jarring experiences for the other people. We can talk about how to do this well. One of them is frequently if you transition from a fairly porous state to starting to set boundaries, it helps to let people know you're doing this. But those people, ultimately, if they really want to be in connection with you, if that's what they really want, will benefit from you being more boundaried. They want to be in relationship with you. They want it to be there. And so, yes, in some situations, the other people benefit from you not having them. In some of them, the people also, you and them are also getting hurt from your boundarylessness. So that's one. Two, I see, Ricky, I just want to say this while I have it. Corey, your point on obligations and have to were great. I make up you used that whole Sarah Knight thing to just board the fuck train. And Ricky and I were both laughing when you started. I was like, oh, Corey is he just hopped on the swear train. Yeah.
He just wanted to say fuck a lot. He hasn't even watched that TED Talk. Just kidding.
Ricky, where you had a response you wanted to.
Well, I think the thing that you highlighted, Justin, which is really important, which is in relationships with someone that does love us and does want the best for us, I think you're also highlighting individuals who have done their own work around boundaries as well. I think that's when shit gets really fucking hot. Like when I've done boundary work and thought about what's important to me, and you have done it as well. So we all are kind of openly communicating and working to uphold and maintain our own boundaries and also respect each other's boundaries. And we can have that conversation and we can actually be incredibly present. Then yes, that's really beautiful. I think the thing that more often we are struggling with is we're partnering with some in the interrelationship around boundary setting. We're working with someone who might not want to respect boundaries, who might not want them to be communicated, who might not even understand them for themselves. Right? If you've ever worked in like a really toxic work environment and you start trying to set boundaries around like when you need to leave and you're working with a manager or mentor or a team that they don't do that, their initial response is a little like, fuck you. But really you're like, dude, you should be thinking about this too. Like it's not a badge of honor that you're taking this call from your doctor's office where you're getting treated for appendicitis. True story. That happened to me once, that the guy joined the fucking client call from a doctor's office because he had appendicitis. I was like, a great opportunity to not answer the phone. Great opportunity to not join us, right? And so I think that the boundary work, when we're all working on boundaries, it's beautiful. The reason why boundaries are so hard is because we're not all working on boundaries and we don't want boundaries set around us.
Yeah, the last thing that I want to say, which I think also sort of speaks to this point, is the one other mistake that I see people make is, and this is very much in our culture, and we've sort of spoken to this, is that when I enforce boundaries, the way to do it is I need to make myself right for it. I can't just enforce a boundary. And the way that I do it is I try and make you wrong for what you've done. And I try and inject shame over into you. This is so common. It was in my family system as I've grown up. You see it in work cultures everywhere. It's in order to set a boundary, I need to shame you and make you wrong for it because I can't just set the boundary. And that, the two results of that, again, if we're talking about how to have boundaries be fundamentally empowering to both people, if every time I need to assert a boundary, I need to shame the person on the other side, well, either one, they collapse to that and they go, you're right, I'm so shameful, I'm so terrible. You actually haven't empowered them. You separated yourself. I got a thumbs up over here. The tech loves these points I'm making today. And then two, frequently, I'm sure we've all had this experience, but you go to set a boundary and make the other person wrong. And what happens to you all when they do that? I don't know. I usually get pissed off because I don't like feeling shamed by other people. And then what happens is Joe Hudson at Art of Accomplishment calls this a game of shame hot potato, which is what started. I have to set a boundary, but I feel kind of uncomfortable and ashamed about it. So when I go set the boundary, I don't want to feel my shame, so I throw some shame at you. Then you take it, right? Or you've set this boundary with me, and I take it and I go, wow, it feels like you're trying to shame me, and I feel shame, and this is yucky. But I don't want to hold on to the shame, so I go, oh, you're the bad guy. And now we're just kind of in this collapsing spiral of a game of shame hot potato. And fundamentally, we're both setting boundaries with shame, or when we set the boundary, we're setting a boundary to try and get the other person to change rather than just standing in our truth. Both of these things tend to be disempowering or just have the whole thing fall apart in a game of shame hot potato. And so it's a really new thing to say, hey, what does it just look like if I set a boundary from what I want, and I don't need to be right about it and make the other person wrong about it, or I don't need to shame the other party with the boundary.
Justin, as you're talking, I have a question. I don't know if it's tangential or just not. My question is, how do you all think about setting boundaries, or what causes people to struggle to set boundaries, specifically when there are power dynamics at play, when there are like power differentials? Because I think that is one area a lot of people struggle with is my parent, my partner, because I have traditional gender role type beliefs, my boss, my mentor, whoever. Right. These are situations that I think everybody either is or has been in to some degree. And it's like, it's one thing for me to set boundaries maybe with my friends when it's more like a lateral power, there's not a power difference. But what about when there is?
Yeah, I want to answer it twofold. I do think most people even struggle outside of power dynamics. In fact, I know some people who struggle more outside of the power dynamics because they can make the boss or the person in the hierarchy the enemy, and they can't do it with their friends. And because they don't know how to set boundaries without shaming others, they don't know how to do it with the people that they actually love. So one, I think very few, like the way we're talking about boundaries is one really hard and I think pretty radical. Like, I think this is not out loud in the culture of like, hey, boundaries are about you. They're not about trying to change the other person. They actually increase your capacity to be with the other person. So one is just the lack of models. I do think too, Corey, I let me pull the thread all the way down. Well, one is in those situations, there's a way where, sure, let's say we're talking about a boss, that person in the context of the company does have some power over me. I am victim to their decisions, but ultimately in the context of my entire life, they actually don't. They can change this one aspect of my life, but I'm still empowered to go get another job and do these other things. And so one, a person takes the fact that person does have some power in a specific context and just inherits a total victim position to that person. And I think what that really comes down to, if we go all the way in, is the fear of, like you said, the consequences of setting the boundary if the other person doesn't like it or doesn't respect it. And I think this is where our episode on fear, and Corey, your work with the 4 horsemen and also fear setting, right? I think the work there is, if you notice that fear come up, don't go away from the boundary. Go, well, what if the worst happens? What if I set this boundary and my boss gets worse and they fire me and all of that? And go figure that out so you can be empowered around the boundary.
The question of what's the worst that could happen, I think, is really effective when we're thinking about setting a boundary in a power dynamic space, because it helps you consider around like safety, for example, right? Like, will I be safe, right? If I set this boundary, will I be safe? And if the answer is yes, then it gets a little bit easier, right? If the worst that could happen is something that we can manage and navigate in our beautiful brains, then it's a little bit easier to do it. Navigating what's the worst that could happen can be really productive. I think, Justin, you were saying that part of this conversation that we've been doing such an interesting job around is talking about models around boundary setting and sort of the ones that exist out there and don't. And I think that's also interesting when we're in power dynamics, is recognizing what models exist in boundary setting in that relationship. So if I work in an organization that I want to set boundaries with my boss, look around. Who else is setting boundaries in a way that feels good? And what can I learn from what they are doing? For example, rather than just leaving 30 minutes early, if I notice that Sheila comes an hour earlier and then leaves 30 minutes early, and I'm comfortable with that kind of boundary setting around my time so that I can pick up my kid after school, that might give me some information about how do I want to set the boundary, right? There's usually opportunities to take a look at within the dynamic that I'm in. What are other individuals doing that are working or not working? And how can I leverage that as I set the boundary that will serve me and also won't feel net new to the individual that I'm working with?
Here's the one other thing is frequently, like let's use a job, for example, or a parent or something. It's like, hey, I'm worried if I set this boundary, they're going to cut me off, that I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose the relationship with them. But usually what happens is at some point we start to go, well, I'm going to cut them off. And at this point, that's actually a really beautiful point to start the experiment. Well, okay, so you decide you think you're going to cut yourself off from your mother. You think you're going to quit your job or whatever. If you're not already to the point of having decided that, why don't you've decided you want to disconnect anyway. Try setting the boundaries and see what happens. Because a lot of the times we have projections about what's going to happen if we set a boundary, and they're not actually reality tested. Sometimes they come true, but sometimes they're not. And it can actually be equally as disorienting to set a boundary and have someone respect it, and then have to deal with, I could have set this boundary all along and I didn't.
I agree. Like, I think that a boundary isn't an ultimatum. It's just a statement of expectations. Okay. Because like you said, Justin, if you let resentment fester, well, then when you finally do set a boundary, it's an ultimatum. Do this or else. That's not really how like a healthy boundary, like that's a rigid boundary, right? Like rigid, healthy, porous. This is a rigid boundary, right? I'm not a huge attachment guy or like parent, whatever kind of person. But one idea I do have is that one reason a lot of people struggle to set boundaries is they grew up in an environment where their boundaries weren't respected, even if they set them. So then you kind of quote unquote learn that setting boundaries is futile because they won't be respected anyway. Because you grew up where there is a power differential, that dynamic. So even when you try to set them, the authority at play doesn't respect it. So then you're just like, well, there's no point, right? I think that is a huge factor for a lot of people, depending on how they were raised, and then subsequent other relationship dynamics you get into. Other people, especially in the workplace, and I've seen this, mid-level managers are especially bad at this. They think that having porous boundaries will lead to a promotion. If I'm always available, if I sacrifice everything else in my life for this company, I will be rewarded for it. But this is misplaced loyalty. Like the company just, again, I'm not a good employee. I never was. Well, the one time I was, I got fired, ironically. But I consistently see a lot of very misplaced loyalty. A lot of these companies don't give a shit, right? There's that whole meme about like, if you died, the job posting for your job position would be up before your obituary, right? The company doesn't give a fuck about you typically. Okay. There are some great companies that actually do. They're typically smaller, right? But you are investing all of this loyalty into a person, company, entity that doesn't reciprocate that loyalty or respect, right? I saw that all the years I was a regular employee, especially again like at the mid-level managers or and up, right? Of like, I have to always be on call. I have to always be available. Anytime they call me, I have to come in. I have to respond to this email. I have to do this. I have to volunteer, all this other shit. And some of these things, especially like in academia, are a requirement, right? Like typically when you're trying to go for tenure, you have 7 years to get tenure with a lot of places. At the 7-year mark, you either get it or you're fired, right? So you have 7 years of effectively in some modern version of indentured servitude where you just do whatever they tell you to do. Anytime they like, oh, you got to go to fucking Buffalo Wild Wings at 7 p.m. on a Friday night to do trivia with the Psy-Chi, the psychology student organization. That was literally a thing that happened at my college. Like, hey, you're the non-tenured professors. You have to do this. You don't have to, but if you don't, it'll factor into your tenure eval. So it's like, fuck boundaries. I need this job. Right? That is a huge issue I see people have, is like, if boundaries prevent me from getting promoted. So I need to not have boundaries because then they will value me. They'll see me and I will be rewarded. And that so rarely happens today, if it ever happened at all. So,
yeah. I want to take us, before we start talking about how to really do boundaries well, which I think there's already a lot of juice in here. This is something that exists in my world. So I'm curious if you all have thoughts or see it, but what do you all see as the link between boundaries and anger? Because I over here in my world, there's a very clear link between them. And based on this, what are the implications for how we set boundaries?
I have feelings on this. Am I here?
I can't hear you right now. I'm getting trying to reconnect. I think it was a Riverside
Am I here now?
issue. Now you're here. I'll edit out the weirdness. Yeah, you're good.
No, I was like, I saw it too. So hold on. So one of the things, Corey and Justin, that you both have been highlighting is around the connection between boundaries, obligation, kind of resentment, I think is really strong. So something that I think happens to us is that if we are not being self-aware of what our requirements are around boundaries, and we are not communicating them, right? We got to do both of those, and we're not upholding those boundaries. What instead occurs is resentment. The concept of, it could be resentment because they're doing something that's pissing us off. And we don't understand how to communicate that they're pissing us off. It could be resentment around, I've communicated my boundary and I upset them and I feel like they should just be on board, or they're ignoring my boundary, or they're doing something different. And ultimately, that feeling of resentment, it has like a bottling up feeling to it, at least in my experience. It's resentment, it's obligation. It's honestly, you feel like you're getting cut off at the knees because you can't actually get out what you need to get out, and it's getting contained. And then it kind of erupts and explodes in moments that are not productive. And so I think that it's very closely tied to resentment breeding into distress and anger and frustration with the other individuals, with ourselves, with the organization as a whole, because it's a feeling of lack of control and lack of support for self. They hang out right next to each other. I feel like it's very rare that people's response around boundaries is sadness. It's more often frustration, anger, resentment, kind of hot, heaty, fiery responses.
Yeah. While we're here, I just want to say this. I think boundaries are, when they're done well, are clean, what's called clean expressions of anger, right? So I think boundaries are rarely not angry things. Anger is an emotion that says, hey, I want something to change. I'm a no to this. And so a boundary, when done well, it's not that there's anger opposite. It's that what a mentor said to me is, anger absent. It's that what a mentor said to me is, you're not channeling the anger forward or backward. You're channeling it up and down. So forward is, screw you, you shouldn't have done this, that was bad. Internally is, what the hell's wrong with me? Why did I do that? Up and down is just what we said. It's, hey, this is a boundary for me. And if you do that, I'm going to do this. There's a firmness to it. It's anger channeling up and down to go, hey, here's my truth. Now, when Ricky said when boundaries come from resentment, my experience is that resentment is anger that has been stored up. It is unexpressed anger. And so when I find people really stewing in resentment, I frequently go back to and go, well, where didn't you express your anger cleanly right up front that has you now really resentful? And so the key for me, anger and boundaries are they are inextricably tied to each other, because a clean boundary is clean anger made manifest. Corey, you got anything on this one?
Yeah, I think the intention of anger is protective. It is meant to be protective, right? Because anger is very activating, right? When I become angry, I am activated to engage in a certain type of thing. The issue is we typically, like you said, we let it fester to the point that anger becomes maladaptive, right? Because it is uncontrolled, just wanton aggression or violence sometimes, right? Again, verbal violence or aggression, physical, whatever. But I think anger is meant to be protective, in that when our boundaries feel threatened or are violated, anger kicks in to communicate and enforce that boundary. The issue is it typically does it very poorly because we waited too long, so that now we are not in the headspace to respectfully, neutrally communicate those boundaries. We feel threatened. We kick into survival mode, fight or flight sort of deal, typically fight in this scenario. So all of the nice packaging we could typically put around our words and our actions is just gone. And all that is left is anger that is trying really hard to help us, trying really hard to communicate and enforce these boundaries of like, hey, this is unacceptable. The issue is it is overzealous a lot of times and just fucking chaos. And then we typically either we burn that bridge or we have to go back and do damage control, right? But anger is also very educational, because if you frequently get angry when it comes to boundaries, that is symptomatic of something that is going on in your environment. Either you are not communicating effectively at all, and you're having all of these boundary setting conversations in your head, but you're not communicating them to the people around you. And now you're internalizing everything they do as a personal attack, when actually you just didn't fucking communicate what you need. That's a you problem. You should probably work on that shit. And or you may be in an environment that culturally doesn't respect your boundaries, either boundaries in general or your boundaries specifically. So if you find yourself regularly getting fucking angry around boundaries, look at, is this more of a me problem that I can quickly resolve by communicating more effectively, or, emotionally regulating myself more, better? Or am I in an environment that is toxic that I need to start designing my escape plan from?
I also would say, fuck yes to all of that, Corey. Justin and I both nodding like aggressively in response to that. But there was one thing that you say that I think is important too, which is the toxic environment space, right? If I'm in a space that it's not about me, it's about them and their inability. Justin, you had said this, right? It's like, if I think that if I set that boundary that they would go no contact and that's the worst that could happen, then like, why not actually do it now? I think that's part of this as well, is we shouldn't be avoiding a boundary out of fear that it won't work within the environment that we're playing in. A lot of times we don't set it because we say, it's an environment that won't allow it, or that person would never believe my boundary. And so we don't bother setting it, and that resentment breeds and it builds, and we never actually test it. And at the end of the day, if we did do it and they're okay with it, oh my gosh, why did we wait so long? And if we do it and they're not okay with it, at least now we can start thinking about protective measures, whether that's departing from an organization, if it's going low contact or no contact with an individual who's not respecting our values. We can sort of have a little bit more of an informed approach of what to do next. versus
Yeah.
something that's happening entirely in our own heads.
Yeah. Again, if you're afraid to set a boundary for the consequences in the environment, for me, what it says is there's an upstream boundary that you're still unwilling to enforce. The other things I want to say before we move on is it's funny, a lot of people don't set boundaries, and then in coaching, my experience, they're really resentful and they're really blaming Christine. They go, wow, I've got this big anger problem, don't I? And my usual thought is, yes, but it's not the one that you think. A lot of people say, I got to get rid of my anger. And I go, no, you're not externally, your problem is you're not externally manifesting your anger soon enough. If you could set the boundary and manifest it when it was just irritation or frustration, it would resolve. It would come out. You've channeled it. Versus people don't do it. And then, like Corey said, they're enraged and they set it from this really deep fight-flight place. And it's, well, yeah, but your problem isn't with your anger. It's that you're just not letting it show up when it really wants to show up and be expressed. And the last piece that I would say is, Ricky, you said something before, like, we don't set boundaries because they're uncomfortable for us. And my experience is that discomfort with boundaries very frequently ties to discomfort with anger and the discomfort with our fear that anger brings up. And so a deeper root for me is, if you really want to work on your relationship with boundaries and setting them, work on your relationship with your own anger. So we've mapped the territory. Let's give them the vision. How can folks set boundaries in a way that makes things better? Whether it's better relationships with the people around them, whether it's a healthier relationship with work, with the project they're working on. When someone is amazing at setting boundaries, what do you see? And we can think here of inner mindsets and contexts, or really tactics, techniques. How do we set incredible boundaries?
What I see that works, one, I do think a lot of how you package it, like how you communicate the boundaries, is really important, right? Which is why proactively setting boundaries rather than reactively setting them, meaning getting out in front of it, like, hey, here are some of my boundaries, versus saying, hey, you crossed a boundary you didn't even know existed, so let me correct that now, when I feel that I've been threatened or, my boundary violated or something, right? You're inherently in that point going to be more emotional and just less productive of a conversation will be had. So proactively. And this goes like, so for example, when my girlfriend and I first started like talking and we were like, oh, are we going to date or we're not? I was like, look, girl, here's all the good shit about me. Here's the things that I'm willing to compromise on. Here are the things I'm not willing to compromise on. Right. So here are the things that, like, the boundary is a little negotiable. Here are things the boundary is straight up not negotiable. Take it or leave it. I'm good regardless. Right. So it's very proactive. And she did the same thing. And whether or not that was like some serial killer shit to do or not, I'm like, this is what I'm fucking rigid about. This is what I'm okay with. Like, we did it and it worked. And a decade later, we're still together. Right. But it was very much if you want if you want me to be in this relationship or this conversation, basically here are the rules of engagement. You can take it or leave it. Informed decision, consent, super important. Take it or leave it. Doesn't matter. If you don't want it, cool. We'll be friends. We'll part ways and we'll go on. Okay. Versus some couples will do this like 5 or 6 years in, or when they're having kids and it's like, hey, one of my boundaries is I don't want my kids to be raised Christian, or mine have to be raised Baptist. Y'all should have figured that shit the fuck out years ago, right? Like that. If that's a hard line for you, you fucked up a long time ago, right? But people do that because they're afraid of having that conversation. They're afraid of the repercussions of communicating that boundary, right? So that's one thing. One of my other friends, he's got a kid, and early on his kid was basically like, hey dad, I'm trans. And my friend, and where we're from is pretty conservative, pretty rural. And he went back to the family for like a holiday, and my friend, he was very matter of fact. He was like, hey, Your granddaughter is now your grandson. This is their name. You can either support them or fuck off. That is a rigid boundary, but certain things you tend to need rigid boundaries around, right? Now it's like, yes, there's some leeway for like dead naming on accident, of course, but intentionally dead naming or intentionally like, oh, this is like, I don't want my kid raised in this environment. If you want to be in your grandchild's life, these are the rules, these are the boundaries in which you have to abide by in order to do that. You can choose to not respect those boundaries, but the repercussion of that is you don't fucking see them, right? But that goes to your values and how flexible are your boundaries and where are the boundaries that you straight up are not willing to be flexible in. That is a crucial differentiator of knowing like, I'm cool to be a little flexible in this, like not necessarily a lot. It isn't porous, but like there's some wiggle room. There are some exceptions depending on the context where this is a little more flexible, but this one over here isn't, right? And like my girlfriend, she knows this, like I have very, very few rigid boundaries. I try to be as flexible in most situations as possible, but I have a couple. And it's like, look, this is matter of fact. This isn't a, you need to abide by this or you need to change it. It's just, this is my boundary. And then very matter of factly, this is what happens if this boundary is violated. Take that or leave it, whatever you want to do with it, but I'm communicating. Right. And she has the same, but then we go into that knowing that, and it's like, I have no reason to ever violate that boundary. I don't like, that's a boundary I have too. Cool. Right. I think being proactive, being matter of fact, and learning to communicate it hopefully in a way, and this goes back to our communication episode, communicating in a way that you are taking how that can be received by your intended audience so that you can craft it in a way that is as receivable or palatable to that person as possible. But then just being willing to be like, take it or leave it.
I think about it as being the steps are similar, no matter what the situation is, but the flavor is different when it's proactive versus reactive, responsive to a feeling of resentment that might have been built up or like a lack of awareness that a boundary was being violated. And I also think there's some differences depending on if it's work related or relationship. So I'm going to give us two examples. I'm going to run us through with them in terms of how I think about boundary setting. The first step is recognizing that a boundary needs to be set. Right? If I'm just running around and I'm feeling angry and I'm feeling overwhelmed or I'm getting frustrated or every time my phone rings, I'm getting pissed off, I need to recognize that as, oof, maybe I need to set some boundaries. The second step is I have to consider the desire, consider what do I want the boundary to look like? What should this look like? You're going to use their name properly, right? I need to be very clear. What do I want it to look like? The third step is I have to get comfortable with how that might be received. And how negative that might be received, right? If I'm going to be rigid with it, if I'm going to be a little bit more porous, I need to understand, okay, when I deliver this to you, what is that going to do to you? And then I need to communicate it clearly without apologizing. And then I have to uphold it. I actually have to uphold the boundary. So what that might look like, I'm going to give us two different examples because I think that they're a little bit different. I started a new job. I need to end work at 5:00 every single day because that's the time that I pick up my kid. It's a new job. This is great. I'm proactive, like Corey was saying, right? I get to set the stage. So I recognize that it's even an external boundary. It makes it even easier, right? I don't have to, it's what time school closes. It's even easier. I have to communicate it really clearly. I knew I might have said it beforehand. I know that they might be bummed by that. I might communicate it with the information of I will be offline from 5 p.m. until 8 p.m. And then I will be back online from 8 p.m. until 9 p.m. That is when you can reach me. And what's beautiful is that now in our worlds, we have so many tools to support ourselves in this space. So to uphold that boundary after I've communicated it clearly with no apology, I'm not apologizing for having a kid that I pick up at 5:00. I love spending time with my kid at 5:00. Now it's about upholding it. So that could look like blocking my calendar. It could like having an auto reply. It could look like having an auto setup on Slack, right? I can have lots of different ways through technology, through communication that help me uphold that boundary. And I can also recognize that if I do need to be a little bit more porous, I'm super communicative of when, why, and where that happens. So that's proactive. Reactive would look more like, let's say you have someone in your family who calls you all the fucking time. They call you all the time. And you've noticed that every time your phone rings and you see their name, you're pissed. You're pissed. You don't want to answer it, right? Has it like, no, this is not resonating with anyone here. You haven't had this experience. Okay. This happens with folks that I've worked with myself. And so in that situation, you have to recognize, oh, I'm angry every single time this person calls because why? Why am I angry? What is happening here? And in that situation, you might take time and say, you know what it is that I don't want to talk to them as often that they're calling. When we have the conversation, it's not productive. I don't feel like they're present, right? What is pissing me off? Why am I feeling anger? Why am I feeling rage? And then most of us, what we do instead is we start ghosting them. We start skipping calls. We start ignoring them. And then we're like, they'll get the hint. They don't get the hint. They think you're just busy. They call you and then send you a text message afterwards that says, hey, called you at 2 p.m. and 4 p.m., couldn't get through. Call me when you have a chance. And you're like, oh my God, we're not connecting here. And so that's around, we still have to, and then we know, if I communicate this, they might be mad, they might forget, they might be upset. So I have to communicate clearly, listen, I love talking to you. I think that's the difference, is that when I'm proactive, there's an opportunity to sort of just be thoughtful about how this is going to move forward. When it's a boundary that I'm setting after the boundary for me has already been violated, I do have to think about who am I speaking to and how can I help them through this boundary setting process. If it's the first time that I've set a boundary with them, they might feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed or stressed, or they might feel like they've really hurt my feelings. So in that situation, when we're setting a boundary, like with a loved one, we might say, hey, I love you. I love talking to you. And at the same time, I'm having a hard time when you call me during work hours. I'm working during that time. I would still love to talk to you. Why don't we set up a phone date every Thursday night or whatever you want it to be? And you say, outside of that phone date, I'm not going to answer your phone calls during work hours unless it's an emergency. And if it's an emergency, text me and say it's an emergency. We might need to work over what we think is an emergency in the future, but ultimately we're starting to create language around what is the boundary. And then when they do call outside of that Thursday afternoon phone date, we don't answer. I say all of that as if this is really easy. I think the thing that we're all highlighting here is like boundaries are really messy. We all have a really hard time with it. I think at the end of the day, boundary setting is so incredibly difficult because it forces us. We have to think about our own desires. We have to communicate them effectively. We have to uphold something that feels uncomfortable for the other individual or for ourselves. We have to really focus on our own self-respect. And it's sticky, it's messy, and it changes over time too. Something that wasn't a boundary now is. And we might need to communicate that shift. But one of my favorite things is when we do set the boundary, we do not apologize for setting the boundary. I do not say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just busy. No, this is my boundary. I do not apologize because if I apologize, I have created wiggle room with you. My boundary, when I set it, it is firm, it is clear, this is what I'm going to do about it, and I don't feel guilt about it.
Yeah, I wanted to speak more because I think there's a lot of good tactical juice we've had. Just to mindsets that I think are really helpful. The first is what we've already covered here, which is it's really helpful to go, hey, what this boundary is for is one, it's so I can respect myself, right? I'm creating this because I want to generate self-respect and I have respect for our relationship. And therefore, I want to be clear about what my boundaries are. When you don't state a boundary, it's not that the boundary is not there. It's not that when people cross it, there's no consequences. There are consequences, but it's confusing for the other person and passive aggressive and resentful. So when I go to set a boundary, it's about respect for myself, for you, and for our relationship. Even more deeply, if it resonates with you, boundary is really about, hey, I love myself enough to set this boundary. I think I'm important enough. I care enough about myself. I also love you enough. And I love our relationship enough. And so really, when I want to set an empowered boundary, we're talking about tapping into like deep respect and love and care. And what that happens is then the boundary can come out absent the need to shame or make the other person right or try to change the other person. If you notice that the boundary is feeling really like blamey and criticizy and you have to make the other person wrong, the experiment that I'd run is sit with, this is called owning your unconscious commitment in conscious leadership language. Sit with the fact that up until this point, you have been committed to the issue by not setting the boundary. The fact that you didn't set the boundary when it first came up was what generated the issue. It was how you co-created the issue. And sit in the tension of that reality and see if it can take you out of this version of like righteous victimhood we spoke before, where it's their problem because they should know better and I expected this for them. Because it's really hard to set a clean boundary until I've dropped into respect for myself, love, and I've owned how I've co-created it, how I had an expectation I didn't voice, and I've let resentment build. You'll know that you've hit a boundary when it increases your capacity to be with the other person, when it increases your capacity to be with the thing you're setting a boundary around, when it actually generates more appreciation and more love for that person. Because what you're saying is, hey, I'm going to consciously disconnect so I can go be with me and then come back to you and really be available to you. And so it's not going to happen before you set the boundary. You need to set the boundary, but you'll know that you've really set the sweet spot of the right boundary when you go and there's like an exhale and a relief and you're like, okay, great. And now you're actually like, oh, okay, well, I can now be with that person. It allows me to be with them more effectively because I trust and know that I can take the space that I need. If we get more tactical, one thing I used variables. So I'll call this like the XYZ method of setting boundaries, which I think a really clean boundary looks something like, hey, if X happens, or if you do X, I'm going to do Y. So if you step over this boundary, if you do this thing, I'm going to do Y. And you might go, and here's why, right? I just don't have the capacity to be with that. I'm going to go and take some time. And then we can come back together. We'll come back at Z. So frequently boundaries might be like, hey, I'm in a relationship that feels kind of aggressive or abusive or uncomfortable to me. And it says, hey, if I perceive you're getting aggressive, more thumbs up. Yes, the tech loves me today. I got a new computer. I didn't turn that setting off, apparently. If I perceive you getting aggressive with me, I'm going to step away. I'm going to step away from the conversation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in and I'm going to check in an hour from now. If you feel like you've diffused some energy and you feel available, you can come back then. But here's when we're going to come back together. Same thing might be a boundary with work for work-life balance. Hey, I've got a dinner with my parents tonight, so I'm going to leave at 6. I'll be back online in the morning. Or I'll be back online later. And so that's really, really helpful. The one other tactical thing that I've heard that I think is really helpful, and I've seen this with startup founders, but Joe Hudson first used this example with his father, who's an alcoholic. Sometimes the boundaries need to start really big so that they can get smaller and more nuanced. So for him, his dad was an alcoholic, and at first it said, I just can't be with you. I can't be around you right now. And that was the initial boundary that he needed to set, so he knew that he could actually generate separation from his father. So sometimes if the boundary feels really big, that's just what the boundary is. And then what he realized was, oh, no, I actually love my dad. I do want to be around him, but I don't want to be around him when he's drinking. So the next boundary was, hey, if you're drinking, I'm going to leave. I'm not going to be around you, and we'll come back when you're sober when I feel available to it. This damn thumbs up. And then eventually with the boundary became, hey, actually, I can be with him when he's drinking, but it's a certain way that he is when he's drinking that I won't be with. So, hey, it's okay if we're together when you're drinking, but when you get this way, I'm going to walk away. And again, he needed to do that so he could give himself the permission to first separate and then go, okay, well, I miss you. I want to be with you, but now I'm going to give myself permission to separate when you're drinking. And then finally, I'm going to give myself permission to do this. Founders I've seen do this with their companies when they have a negative relationship with work and they're overwhelmed. And what it starts is I need to take a break. I need to step away from the company entirely because it's too much for me. this doesn't actually just apply to founders, it's anybody's relationship with work. I need a vacation. I need to be totally away. Then they might say, okay, well, I can come to work, but I need better boundaries around, I'm going to stop at this time. I'm going to stop for this. I'm going to stop for that. And the boundary gets to get more nuanced. And so notice if the boundary set and big, like just trust the process, set the boundary, see what happens. And allow it to shift as you find at your capacity. Again, this is that notion of if you set the boundary, it's likely that your capacity to be with that thing as it is will go up. If you, let me actually say, set, and as Ricky said, enforce, adhere to, continue with the boundary. You're going to have to do that second part, but usually when you do that, then you have created a new form of relating to the thing that increases your capacity to be with it.
I think there's two other there's two other things that came up for me, Justin, while you were talking, which one is in terms of going big with the boundaries is recognizing it's easy to loosen the reins. It's harder to tighten them. And recognizing that it might be easier to go stronger with a boundary and recognize I went stronger than I needed to, and I can start to loosen them. It's easier that way. And I think that's important as a mindset as you're approaching boundary work.
Yeah. One other thing, Rick, I just want to
go.
You made a good point, which is don't apologize for your boundaries. Yes. And sometimes especially if you're new to this, you're probably going to set them kind of messy at first, and you may shame the other person. It may happen. So also give yourself permission to fail at setting boundaries and do it poorly. And then a really heartfelt apology, not for setting the boundary, but hey, that's not how I want to set boundaries with you. Right? Like the boundary's just as real, but I noticed when I did it, I was hot. I had some resentment. I really came at you. That's not how I want to be. Boundary's still real. Not apologizing for the boundary, but I'm still working on how I set them in our relationship.
Yes. Yes. The other thing that came up for me as we were talking is one of the things that we had conversed about is the point of setting the boundaries is to sort of say yes to something that is important to us, right? In order to control here, then we have open here. And something that can be helpful, especially if we're first starting to set boundaries, is actually starting to recognize and identify what are those things that you want to be doing. Why are we setting the boundaries? So for example, work-life balance, it's really hard to leave work at 5 every single day when I don't have something to go to. Right? It's sort of like people really struggle with productive rest or these kinds of things, but that's a whole separate conversation. But for the purpose of this, if the reason why I want to have more balance in terms of my work hours is because I want time to focus on health and wellness, like we had said earlier, then let's set a 5:30 gym session, or let's set a 5:30 walk, whatever it is, and actually letting that external tool help us to maintain and enforce the boundary. It's the thing that's unfair here is that, at some point it's like, well, if you have self-respect and self-support, you can already set the boundary and, of course you can take a break. But for some of us, that's really difficult. And if the reason why we are setting the boundary is in order to have service and something that's important to us, then let's actually leverage that as a tool. Let's have that be so for example, I want to set boundaries with work because I want to have more hobbies outside of, let's go get a fucking hobby. We got to leave work. If I got a ceramics class, I paid for it. It was expensive. I put my money where my mouth is. I got to go throw some clay. Let's go. It's in my calendar. I'm leaving. And that can be a helpful tool to support you in maintaining and enforcing the boundary.
Yeah. Let's go final thoughts on boundaries.
Let's do it.
I have one that was triggered by what Ricky said. What I think all of my tactics and points are pointing to, and Ricky, I think some of yours sparked this for me, is this language may work for some of you, it may not, but try on setting boundaries from the heart. I think that captures a lot in terms of what Ricky said of when you're setting boundaries with someone you love. It's like if you are setting a boundary from the heart, usually what comes up is, hey, I love you. I care about you. This is important. Our relationship's important to me. Honestly, I'm a little afraid to set this boundary. I'm nervous it might cause some disconnection, but it's important enough for me to say it. And here's my boundary. And then like you said, Ricky, here's why it's important to me. And so there's a way where, you can use all the tactics and do all the work. And sometimes in the moment, what I'll say is just see what happens if you just drop into your heart and you set the intention of, hey, I'm just going to give this boundary from my heart.
I love that.
A couple things. When it comes to like setting boundaries, like for self-care and shit like that, there's this whole adage of you can't pour from an empty cup, right? Meaning if you're constantly making yourself available to everybody else and neglecting yourself, you eventually run out of things to give other people. So if you actually care about showing up to others, right? Let's say you don't consider yourself a selfish person and you're a giver, you're service oriented, all other shit. Okay, cool. If you actually want to fully be of service to others, you have to take care of yourself. Otherwise, you will run ragged, you will be empty, and then you will no longer be able to actually serve the people you care to serve. Okay. Setting boundaries is one way you can do that. Work-life balance, that's a whole conversation too, but something as simple as that, right? Of like, hey, I am not available to reply to anything in the evenings, right? Or like me, for example, I typically don't take meetings in the first part of the day. First part of the day is just for me for writing and other cognitively demanding tasks. But then like noon or 1-ish onward until like 3 to 4, that's when I do most of my meetings. Okay. Flexible boundary because like for today's session, it was a little bit earlier my time, but typically I go noon onward. Right. But that's one of those, like, I'm willing to be flexible in certain situations sometimes. But that allows me to be fully present in each of those areas. Right. And then at a certain time I'm done working, and that is the rest of the evening to spend, with friends, loved ones, the gym, shit like that. Right. Cody Sanchez has this really good quote that has stuck with me. And this is much more relevant to creators or people who are more public facing. But she says, be easy to find, but hard to reach. And what she means is make it easy for people to like follow you, subscribe, find your resources, your newsletter, your videos, your articles, whatever. But don't be so available that anybody can hit you up all day, every day. And knowing some of the people I know who are prominent publicly, that allows them to maintain their sanity of like, not everybody has this person's phone number, or not everybody, this person straight up doesn't reply in the comments on their Instagram because they've got 500,000 followers and they're getting thousands of comments every single post. That would be the full-time job, right? Now they communicate that, like they set that expectation of like, don't expect me to respond to every little thing, right? Some people even say like, hey, my VA will respond to you most of the time. Otherwise, and then they're usually the liaison, right? That helps. It helps preserve their sanity so that they can fully show up. Okay. I am a huge fan of basically defaulting to being unavailable. By no means am I a celebrity, but I regularly, even at my level, regularly get a shit ton of people trying to pick my brain or do a quick coffees chat on Zoom. And it's usually one direction, right? Like, hey, Corey, will you help me for free? It's like, motherfucker, like I got a consulting call. Like you can just book that and pay me. I default to no. I am unavailable. If you're looking for a tactical thing, the simple answer of, hey, I don't have bandwidth. Everybody understands that. Hey, I don't have bandwidth to do another fucking call, right? If you want to shoot me a couple questions, I can get back to you asynchronously. That may be a flexible thing that I'm willing to do. But by default, I am unavailable for you so that I can be available to the people I really care about. That is a huge thing. Because before I was like, oh, I owe this person a response because they took the time to message me. They took the time to ask something of me. I owe it to them. You, with very, very few exceptions, you don't owe anybody anything. You owe your kids something. You owe your partner something. Very, very few exceptions. Most people, you don't owe fuck all to anybody. But if you feel this script is in your head of like, I owe this person a yes. I owe this person to come into the office. I owe my boss. I owe my company. I owe my this. You typically don't. Right? So learning to say like, what do I need? What do I deserve? What does self-respect look like to me? How can I embody that? What boundaries can I set to protect the thing I have deemed worthwhile, worth protecting? That's kind of where I start tactically.
Beautiful. Anything else on boundaries?
No is a full sentence.
Beautiful. All right, y'all. That's another episode of No Clear Answers. Like, follow, subscribe. No Clear Answers Nation. I was having a joke with friends about how you have to always call your community nations when you're on YouTube. So, and with that,
Toodles.